is regarded by fans, 6 people on Reddit, as the best JoJo part, with solid character arcs, consistent plot and themes, and incredible artwork. Well, mostly. But why is Steel Ball Run widely considered the best JoJo part? Let's start off with the characters, and who better off than our main character, Johnny Joestar. Johnny Joestar is the most well-written JoJo so far. I've not read part 8 or 9, with a clear character motive being stated within the first couple of chapters. I'm going to do a really crap American accent. This is a story of how I learned to walk again. Not in a physical sense, but in an adolescent to adulthood sort of way. And lo and behold, with the power of the gold rotation, Johnny learns to walk again physically. But what I find more interesting is that we actually get to see this theme of adolescence to adulthood change Johnny, as shown before he was injured. Johnny was a famous jockey and had everything you ever wanted, until one day he skipped the queue for some show and got shot, as you do. But this Johnny before the accident took things for granted and felt that he was better than others. A stark contrast to Johnny now, at his lowest. And when he finally gets a shred of hope from Gyro spinning him onto his horse, he follows him no matter the cost. This is a story of how I learned to walk again. Doesn't even fit. Although the objective changes as Gyro and Johnny grow close, pretty much, yeah. We learn why Johnny was this way, as his dad George Joestar hated him, as he killed his brother Nicholas in a high-speed rat collision, somehow. This was because Johnny had a pet rat called Danny. Who names a rat Danny? Who has a pet rat? George saw Ratatouille and said it's not better than the good dinosaur, so he told him to kill it. Johnny cries for a rat. Not a clue. And Nicholas says he can just let it free. We see this conflict later on, as George won't let Johnny borrow Nicholas's boots because they were his. Christ all. This is where George delivers the Dad of the Year line. God took the wrong son. Yikes. This is why Johnny's the way he is. He uses his arrogance and overconfidence before the bullet as a way of coping, to hide his deep insecurity and pain from his dad. Thankfully, this gets resolved towards the end of the race, as George is shown holding Nicholas's boots and cheering Johnny on. This was a nice scene. See, look how much backstory and depth Johnny has as a character. We're nearly 2 minutes into the video, 8 more and we got some mid-rolls. The most important way in which we see Johnny grow as a character is when he finally achieves his starting goal of learning to walk. It's not this massive achievement that he made it out to be at the start. He even says it himself. I was imagining it'd be a little more dramatic. And directly after, he quickly shifts his concerns to Lucy's safety, which shows how he has changed from selfish to selfless, as his main goal isn't important anymore compared to others. Gyro has changed from just somebody to get Johnny to walk again to being a friend, as Johnny says that he needs to bury Gyro's corpse, as if his friend gets washed away, he couldn't be okay with that. He also tells Lucy and Steven about Gyro's goal to save Marco, and how the last thing he needs to do is to tell Gyro's father and country what race he ran and give his thanks. Would this guy do that? No, probably not. This is the growth from adolescence to adulthood. He cares about the people around him and puts others before himself, rather than a bullet before himself, like before. Gyro Zeppeli is the co-protagonist alongside Johnny, and he's just as fleshed out, if not more than Johnny, as he is the main driving point for Johnny's development throughout the story. Gyro also introduces the moral complexities which weren't as developed in previous parts, with there being a clear distinction of good and evil, such as Dio and Jonathan. Gyro's inherited job through generations is an executioner, which is already a morally complex issue, coupled with the fact that Gyro chose to compete in the race to free an innocent boy that he would have to kill as an executioner, going against his family's tradition to do what he thinks is right, which is the main part of Gyro's character. This differs from Johnny's attitude towards his father, that he is to blame. However, this contrasts Gyro's character from the outside, as a selfless act of saving Marco leads him to use everything to his advantage to win, such as the power of spin, and he only teaches Johnny about spin when it's absolutely necessary, such as when they're in danger. But as the story progresses, Gyro's selflessness shines through. That was hard to say. Such as him helping Johnny find the corpse parts and letting Lucy on his horse to get to safety, despite saying that no one will ride this horse because Lady Luck will get jealous. Fair enough. Despite this, Gyro can't hide his selflessness when it really matters. Lucy Steele differs from Johnny and Gyro, as despite lacking a stand ability for most of the story, she uses her knowledge, strength and integrity to save the people she cares about, despite the toll on herself, and many of her feats actively drive the story forward, repeatedly saving the protagonist at pivotal moments. What's all these tongue twisters in the video? Christ, what am I writing this script? Showing that Lucy is a fully realised character, rather than being in the background or just a plot device. From her first introduction, Lucy's clearly out of place, but when she overhears Valentine's true intentions with the race and that Steven was being used, she doesn't let this pass her by and actively tries to stop his plans, despite lacking the power compared to her enemies. This leads to key moments such as stealing the corpse part coordinates, disguising herself to take the heart, and my favourite part, no joke, my face was literally like this when reading. What? When Lucy took Diego's head to himself to kill him and stop him from sealing away the corpse. This moment is even more impactful coming from Lucy, as to how much she's faced during the story so far, and how in the end she is the one who stops Diego from obtaining the corpse. However, one of the drawbacks I'd say with Lucy's character arc is she experiences traumatic events without having time to process them. You could argue about her feat with Diego, but I feel like that doesn't really give closure. Steven Steele is misunderstood, especially considering the context behind his relationship with Lucy isn't explained until 2/3 into the story, which definitely leaves it up to the reader as to what they think of him. I mean, it's obvious you're meant to feel unsure about him due to this fact, and it reinforces the moral complexities of characters in Steel Ball Run compared to previous parts of just good and evil. But this is the one thing I got spoiled on with this meme. We find out that Steven isn't who we think he is, and Lucy helps Steven come up with the idea of the race. But he protected Lucy, which is possibly why Lucy goes out of her way to save Steven's life later on. Diego Brando is basically Dio done right, with the reasoning of his actions not being as straightforward as previous parts, due to his backstory showing how badly he's been treated his whole life, whereas part 1 Dio is the way he is because of his ego and fate. Diego is shaped by his will to survive, which is from growing up in poverty. This makes us feel a bit more sympathetic to him as a character, as he's just a product of his environment, rather than a symbol of evil.
Fuck Dio! Fuck that nigga Dio! How can any one man be such a fucking asshole? Man, fuck this dude, Dio, man. Let's continue.
Like Dio in previous parts, Diego serves as a contrast to Johnny as a character, as both of them were once prodigies but have since fallen from grace and have entered the race in order to prove themselves. However, it's how they go about their actions that differ. Johnny's power increases as his bonds deepen, such as Gyro teaching him spin, risking himself for Lucy, and honouring Gyro's death. But Diego's powers increase as he discards people, such as working with Valentine for the wealth he's promised, using the race to pivot his career, and leaving behind people when they slow him down, such as Hot Pants during the Love Train fight. Johnny opens up, whereas Diego closes people off. Now, the moment you've all been waiting for, the character everyone loves to discuss. Of course I'm talking about Peg the Horse. Wait. Funny Valentine is a funny one, literally. As in his mind, he's not a bad guy, with his goal being to obtain all the corpse parts, which grant him D4C Love Train. The ability allows him to redirect misfortune, either directed at him or the country, to elsewhere in the world, making America a utopia, but at the expense of others, dealing with a major moral complexity of patriotism, and whether it's right to let others suffer at the expense of your country thriving. Valentine is patriotism personified.
I just wanna catch my fish.
He even teleports with an American flag. He shows what happens when love for your country overpowers empathy for others. He sees Americans as a nation and not as individuals, which is why he doesn't see the issue in diverting America's misfortune to somewhere else. This idea of America as a nation makes Valentine a great antagonist, as he juxtaposes Johnny's journey, learning that individual lives matter, such as Nicholas and Marco, whereas Valentine believes that individuals are justified losses for something greater. That's all that covered. Now let's move on to the stands and fights. The stands and fights in Steel Ball Run take it back to basics, as Johnny's stand isn't even introduced until chapter 26. In terms of Johnny's stand, Tusk, I think it's interesting how it links with Gyro's spin technique, as the later acts of Johnny's stand utilise spin to create infinite rotations, whereas other parts didn't have as much as a direct link to the story. I also like the inclusion of different acts of Tusk, as it shows how Gyro helps Johnny grow throughout the story by teaching him more about spin. In terms of the stand fights, my favourites would have to be with Ringo, as it helps Johnny adopt Ringo's belief of a true man's world, which leads him to face consequences and move forward without excuses. This also helps Johnny grow as a character. Tubular Bells, as it shows Lucy's drive to protect those around her, despite lacking a stand, but still using her resolve instead. D4C's first introduction with Who Shot Who, which gives the stand a sense of mystery, which hooks you, and the world fight at the end of the story, because of Lucy's feat to stop Diego. However, there were some not so great fights, such as the Sounderman fight, not a clue what was going on there, as well as Chocolate Disco. And last but not least is the ending of Steel Ball Run, in which I think is one of the story's biggest flaws. Look, I like Johnny's reflection at the end, as it mirrors the beginning of the story, but it's the last page that does it for me. One page to summarise the events of after the race, in which we learn that Marco was set free, but later died of a cold. I was reading this and I thought the fan translators put it in as a joke. I get the reasoning behind it, to raise the question of what Gyro was truly fighting for, but come on. A cold? That's my main criticism of Steel Ball Run. The ending just seems a bit too rushed. It's definitely better than part 5's, but I had 5 chapters left and I'm thinking, how's he going to end this? Also, whilst we're on the topic, another flaw I noticed was the focus on the first stage to the other contestants, such as Poker Loco and
Norisuke.
I get he's important in later parts now, but I found these characters interesting and a bit annoying that they were just sidelined for the rest of the part. If I'm being honest, these aren't really flaws, as it just left me wanting more. Overall, is Steel Ball Run the best part? I'd say so. Although this is still my personal opinion. I'll admit, after I finished it, I felt a little bit empty in the sense of, is that it? But I think in reflection, that's positive, to leave the audience wanting more, as it shows how invested you have them as readers. I had the same with part 5's ending, but in further research, the first tab of Google, I connected the dots with the Rolling Stones arc, and in the same case with Steel Ball Run, in terms of contrasting characters with depth and themes consistently running throughout, giving it an overarching story. All that's left now is part 8. That's a real panel. What?